Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to be going over part 2 of chapter 2 of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. We're going to be looking at the first encounter between Mr. Utterson and Mr. Hyde. Mr. Utterson has become basically obsessed with meeting Mr. Hyde and trying to find out more about him because of all the mystery that is around Mr. Hyde up to this point. And if you haven't read chapter 2 recently, please go and do that. And please make sure you're making notes on these comments because it's some of the core analysis and core context that you will need for your exams in the future, okay? So let's dive straight back in. So Mr. Utterson has been to his friend Dr. Lanyon's house. He's very disturbed by this Mr. Hyde guy that's just randomly come in. Mr. Hyde now is the benefactor of Dr. Jekyll's wealth if Dr. Jekyll were to die, which is very odd because Utterson and Lanyon, who are the oldest best friends of Dr. Jekyll, have never even heard this name up until very recently. Dr. Lanyon has never heard of this name, right? So Utterson is laying in bed, he's tossing and turning, he can't sleep, and he realizes he needs to meet Mr. Hyde to try to work out this mystery. So he uses this kind of famous line, which we've got this little bit of a play on words and also the juxtaposition, obviously. If he is Mr. Hyde, then I'm going to be Mr. Seek. And obviously that links to the playground game or the kids' game of hide and seek as well. So from that point on, Utterson is just constantly at that door that Mr. Enfield pointed out in chapter 1, and he's constantly, rain or shine, all different times of the day, whenever he can get out of his legal work as a lawyer, he's there waiting to see if he can catch a glimpse of Mr. Hyde and eventually meet Mr. Hyde. And we get this sense that he's just obsessed with this. And the way that Utterson initially hears Mr. Hyde before he even sees him is already quite sinister. We have the idea of these footsteps and they're getting closer and closer and louder. But notice the way that Robert Louis Stevenson, the writer, uses the sibilants. Steps drew swiftly nearer, swelled suddenly louder. So I think that the reason for the sibilants is to immediately create a sense of foreboding that this is not going to be a good meeting. This is sort of the introduction of the villain. We've heard about the villain, Mr. Hyde, from Mr. Enfield, but now we're actually going to experience him ourselves firsthand as Utterson meets him. So we've got this sibilance, and he's quite monstrous and unusual in his interaction straight away. When Utterson first approaches Mr. Hyde, he shrinks back with a hissing intake of air. Notice that word hissing especially adds to the sibilance again. Maybe has connotations even of like a serpent or a snake. Often snakes and serpents are thought of as a sort of evil or symbols of evil, right? And they have a little bit of a talk together, and Utterson is asking to see Mr. Hyde's face, and Mr. Hyde is just being very stereotypically villainous again. He snarls loud in a savage laugh. So snarled and savage, we've got that sibilance again. Snarled is a very aggressive verb choice as well. And all of this also creates a sense almost of an animalistic sort of imagery around Mr. Hyde. He doesn't seem human, and that's mentioned multiple times in the novel, in this chapter, in lots of other chapters. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. You see that weird mystery again. Utterson sees there's something that doesn't seem right about Mr. Hyde, and yet there's no obvious actual deformity to the man, right? So again, we get this sense of almost a supernatural, strange dislike for this character. There's something within him that just seems evil. And Mr. Utterson is filled with disgust, loathing, and fear in terms of Mr. Hyde. Now, the reason that's interesting is because that's also a subversion of expectations. Remember, in chapter 1, Mr. Utterson is described as someone who is often the last good influence in downgoing men. So he's used to hanging out with criminals and drug dealers and alcoholics and prostitutes and all kinds of different, criminal people. Normally he's not fazed by that, but something about Mr. Hyde fills him with disgust, loathing, and fear. And that's very telling, because normally he wouldn't be really affected at all by hanging out with a criminal. He hangs out with criminals all the time as the lawyer of those criminals. And they're all, aggressive and strange people, a lot of them anyway. I think I used the words hardly human, and I realized that that's literally one of the quotes. the man seems hardly human, something troglodytic, shall we say. Now, the word troglodytic is relating to caveman or primitive, yeah? The idea of a earlier version of man. Now, that's also a very important context link because, of course, when this novel was written, this was very close to when Darwin wrote Origin of the Species. And this was the first time, really, that the idea that mankind may have come from evolving from animals had ever been really seriously thought about. So that link to troglodytic maybe is a little bit of a link to Origin of the Species as well by Charles Darwin. And this would have been something that the Victorians were thinking about quite a lot at this time. So that's a science reference, but then he brings in, if ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend. So we have science in the troglodytic comment, and then we have religion in the I've never seen Satan's signature on a face so clearly, sort of linking to a religious background. Yeah. Now, the reason that that's important is because you need to know that Stevenson himself had a quite divided family. He was raised in a Presbyterian, Christian, religious background, and his family even had priests and other, church members within his family. But his family also had a lot of scientists, and therefore his family was quite split, right, between religion, which may have been saying certain messages, and science, which may have been challenging some of those messages. Now, looking at this in the future now, here in, time of recording 2024, we can often actually reconcile a lot of what religion says with a lot of what science says. There's no reason why a god couldn't have created this universe whilst also using mechanisms such as evolution. That's certainly possible, right? But at this time, it was really a debate of one or the other. You can either be religious and put your faith in religion, or you could be scientific and put your faith in science. And Stevenson was kind of right in the middle of this Victorian debate and this Victorian split that was happening. Utterson then goes to the front of the house, because as we know, that is the blistered broken door that Hyde goes in is the back door of Dr. Jekyll's house. Mr. Utterson goes to the front of the house, the nice, beautiful entrance to Dr. Jekyll's house, and he's greeted by Dr. Jekyll's servant called Paul. Probably a butler, I would say, actually, is a better word for Paul. And Utterson challenges this. He says, Mr. Hyde is in the dissecting room in the back of this house. Is that right? Is that okay while Dr. Jekyll isn't here at home? And Paul, the servant or the butler, says, yes, quite right, Mr. Utterson. We actually have orders to obey Mr. Hyde whenever he's here. So again, do you see how this adds even further to the mystery? Like, this is really odd. Imagine if someone who you didn't know anything about randomly was allowed to come into your house and just go in the garage whenever he wants, or, just enter your home, even if you're not there. It just seems very odd, especially in the Victorian context. So this adds to the mystery and the confusion even more. And Utterson comes to a conclusion. He decides that it must be the fact that when Dr. Jekyll was younger, and obviously Mr. Utterson knew Dr. Jekyll while he was young, Dr. Jekyll must have done some crime, some bad thing, which now Mr. Hyde is blackmailing him about, right? Mr. Utterson doesn't specifically say what it could be, but he does say he was wild when he was young. He was wild when he was young. And again, notice the semicolon there, which I think is meant to be used for emphasis and tension. So we get the sense that Utterson knows that Dr. Jekyll did some bad things in his past, and that's why Mr. Hyde is able to blackmail him. But he then has a really interesting idea at the end. He says, okay, well, if Dr. Jekyll is being blackmailed by Mr. Hyde, he must have secrets of his own, black secrets by the look of him, which his secrets compared to Dr. Jekyll's would look like sunshine. So Utterson comes up with a bit of a plan here. We see the juxtaposition. We see it's a long, complex sentence, which maybe creates some excitement. Long sentence equals excitement and energy. And he comes up with this idea that he just needs to find some bad dirt on Mr. Hyde, and then he's going to be able to blackmail Mr. Hyde to stop Mr. Hyde blackmailing his friend Dr. Jekyll. Do you see how loyal that also shows Mr. Utterson to be? You want friends like that, for sure. You want friends that are your ride or die kind of friends, that actually want to be there with you, even through the hard times. And that's the kind of friend that Mr. Utterson clearly is to Dr. Jekyll. We'll leave it there for today. Thank you very much. See you in the next one.